What is the most misunderstood playable race in my campaign world? This is the continuation of the hashtag My 30-Day World, and as I've said in prior entries, my world is based off of my game Stellar Frontiers, i.e. Interstellar Frontiers, the settled space. The game itself allows for quite a few playable races, if you will. There's humans, and then there's a whole collage of genetic based human genobes, and then there's some aliens as well. As for playable, everything's playable. And then there's mechanics for the player to create unique genetic imprints or alien races and or genetic genomes of the human genetic manipulation to the human genome for their own purposes, and as long as they follow the four rules of common sense when it comes to developing them, officially they would be acceptable. If you're trying to recreate Krypton and the Superman people, you're not going to fly it because that is against one of the four rules of common sense. We're not trying for that kind of game. But if that's what you are happy with when you're playing your own version of it, I'm good with it, because that's kind of the point of any game system, is to play and get enjoyment out of it. And if you change the rules to suit what you want it to be and you're happy with it and your players are happy with it, nobody's going to complain unless you try to publish it. And then they might try to complain if it's plagiarism. Anyhow, there's a number of races. Most misunderstood. Well, I can think of two or three right up top. The old Venus is one of them, but my favorite is probably the Shadans. And I want to make sure before I get off on that, if that's, because we're starting to work down to the end of this thing. Okay, there's no other entries for this particular topic, so we'll go with the Shadans. The Shadans are my favorite genome, and they're my preferred for playing a house, because for starters, I created them. They're my personal house race. The base concept here is a futuristic human genetic manipulation version of the Drow, with some of the nasty stuff that goes with it, and without some of the nasty stuff that goes with it. Since I don't have alignments in this game, there is no good or evil, no chaotically this or lawful that. You are deemed what you are, and your house is deemed what it is by the opinions of others that you interact with. So where goes the house, or where goes the house lord, goes the house. Where goes the house lady, goes the house, if you prefer. And so if you tend to be dark and twisted and mean and cruel and so on and so forth, you're going to develop that reputation amongst the fellow house lords that you may be playing with. And if you're playing by yourself and you don't see yourself that way, then it's a moot question, right? So my backstory is the Shadans. Some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the natural progression. When I started with this stuff, Paris Hilton was still really hot in the news, and one of her favorite ornaments was the stupid little dog. She had her little chihuahua that would stick its head out of her purse every now and then. And for all intents and purposes, the dog was just another ornament to her. It was her pet, but yet she wore it like it was jewelry. It was a statement. And part of it, the dog was some kind of miniature version that was genetically engineered. And we have a number of dog species today that would not exist naturally if it wasn't for human breeding programs to create these type dogs. And in nature, if something were to happen, these dogs would eventually die out because they're physically not capable of doing or surviving well on their own, because they have flaws. So I thought, if the humans continue with this concept of cloning and human genetic manipulation, how long will it be? How far will they go? If we didn't have the moral checks and balances that we tend to do today, there's a lot of furor and uproar over the idea of human cloning. There are concerns about where we go morally and ethically. If we make a clone of ourselves, is this a living, breathing person with rights, or is this a duplicate of ourselves that we can harvest for parts? I mean, there's so many unspoken questions yet, and I thought, well, what if we get past all that? We go thousands of years in the future where it's no longer considered an issue. What would humanity have done? We've already done the super soldier programs. We've already created genetic manipulations to exploit environments. So what's next? And it's obvious to me what would be next is the genetic manipulation for physical appearances and or oddities. And if I were the mega corporations like Disney today, and I jumped them thousands of years in the future where they become interstellar corporations of massive proportions, and they're trying to entertain the mobs and at any cost and expense, then why not create these fantasy worlds, these, cosmic Disneyland, where entire planets are devoted to themes, the ultimate theme park. So when we talk about Jurassic Park, an example, well, that's what they did. They created a theme park by bringing back from the dead some prehistoric beasts that have been nothing but problems. So why not stop there? Why not create an actual fantasy world where you've got orcs and you've got goblins and you've got drow and elves and dwarves and all this all coexisting and trying to eke out their lives in a superimposed tech level that makes them operate in or about the era of the Middle Ages, or what would be appropriate for a fantasy setting, the ultimate Westworld setting once again, where the humans, we don't have the Star Trek's version of the holosuite. Instead, we create an actual physical entity where you then go in and intermingle with in one of two forms. You either intermingle with them using robotic avatars where you submerge yourselves in a matrix-like environment. Think of Avatar, where the feller gets into the simulation pod and his body goes to sleep, but his mind superimposes itself into this avatar that now interacts with the local people. Same thing in this case. Or if you're really daring enough and you're willing to sign waivers, you could actually go into the setting itself and physically interact with these creations whose whole purpose there is, their whole existence is about entertaining you, whether they were aware of it or not. And ideally, the Shideans were not aware that they were a created race until much later. They also were not aware until they became aware that they weren't alone in the universe, that not everybody was what they seemed. And at some point, one of the early, and I think it was when the AI war broke out, the homeworld where the Shideans were created and populated along with a number of other fantasy races was abandoned in the chaos of the war and the desperate attempts to stop the bug invasions from devastating everything. Their particular planet was left to its own devices for several centuries. The Shideans, being crafty and clever and manipulative and secretive to a fault, became very aware of the fact that something wasn't all that correct in the world. And once they discovered that the truth, they didn't fall apart emotionally. They acted on making an attempt to gain control. So, the original Shideans easily conquered their own planet, became the de facto alpha house, or the alpha race on the planet, and while the chaos of the bug wars and then the following AI wars was raging, the Shideans in their quiet corner of the cosmos began to conquer and gain control of through manipulation and dirty tricks and trade agreements and outright bribes and potentially even brute force neighboring colonies, and started colonizing additional planets of their own using stolen technology. They learned to replicate the technology and build their own, and by the time settled space was recovering from two really nasty interstellar wars that almost left the known races of the galaxy in shambles, by the time somebody woke up and remembered that, hey, there's this whole big, huge Euro Disney, cosmic Disney sitting over there just waiting to be reopened, they approached and discovered sitting there a small stellar nation of some 2 or 3 dozen inhabited systems controlled by the Shideans, who had, well, not an overwhelming navy or military, had enough there to make their point. And through some clever negotiations and interventions of the Terran Imperial Terran government, specifically the Emperor, they were declared a sovereign race and a sovereign in a galactic house. And there goes the house. This was thousands of years ago. So my particular choice were the Shideans. The Shideans, in the modern sense, 4,000 years later, everybody assumes they're spies. And for all intents and purposes, not every Shidean's a spy, but every spy could be a Shidean. The Shideans are masters of the 007 mindset, the masters of espionage and skullduggery, and they mastered technologies and created technologies that allow them to change their physical appearances to some degree, cloaking devices. They understood that they'll never have the power, behind the throne, so to speak, by brute force. So they use cunning and seduction and all these other abilities. They also continue to colonize. And my startup house was one of those colonial efforts. The Shideans are often accused of being spies. The Shideans have a almost cat-like, insatiable need to know what's going on in somebody else's back room. They're the ones who will go to your house and visit, and while they get an opportunity, will not only go through your medicine cabinet, but they will look under the sink. They will look behind the sink if they can figure out a way to do it without you noticing, and potentially they will be in there going through your unmentionables drawers at the first opportunity, not because they're trying to find something to use against you, but because they want to know what you're hiding, because it's amusing to them to know that they know your secrets. And if you don't know that they know, it's even more better. And they practice on that. They become a natural pastime. Not unlike, if you're familiar with the Belgariad, there is a group of individuals. There's a kingdom whose prime export is espionage, and they have that similar mindset. I like that sort of thing. I like that kind of, we're using our wits and we're using backroom dealings instead of doing the brute force approach to controlling things. And that was my preference for a misunderstood race. So there you have it. I probably could have did a little better explanation on it, but this will serve. Right on.